Born and raised in Longview, so I have a fascination with the story behind the city. And I live in Kelso now, but I live on land that my great-great-grandfather homesteaded in 1876. So I've kind of, this is my home. We're very fortunate in Longview that the history of Longview has been recorded right from the beginning. Most cities don't have a written history, let alone a picture history like we do. But most of you here probably have seen or even have some of the excellent books that have been written over the years. Recently there was the Longview book put out by the Arcadia series. It's got a lot of pictures in it of the early years. Just recently the Longview Daily News and the museum conspired to put out this book of memories, and it's got a lot of wonderful pictures that you won't find many places else. But my favorite book of Longview is the one that was written by John McClellan Jr., and it's the history. He wrote one at 25 years, and then he updated it 50 years, and this was a 75-year edition. And it has the story of Longview. And if you don't have this, I encourage you to try to find it. It's not for sale here at the museum. They're sold out. But you see them on eBay or bookstores. Occasionally you'll have them. But I don't know if anybody's going to do a 100-year book, but I hope so. The story of how I got into collecting these postcards is it's interesting in a way, but kind of sad in another, because I wanted a simple hobby. It wasn't going to cost me very much. It'd be easy to manage. And I figured, well, I love pictures, but I said, if I just collect postcards, there can't be more than a dozen or two of those. And I started collecting Longview and Kelso postcards about 25 years ago. And that binder over there has my Longview postcards in it. I have another one just like it that has Kelso postcards, and I branched out and I collect Cowlitz County postcards too. And there's 600 postcards in that binder, and they're all different. And they're not even close to being all there are, because most of these postcards are numbered. You can tell how many there were in a series, and so on. But and it's getting harder to find them. eBay was a wonderful thing when it came along, because if you think about it, people, in fact, when Longview was being built, there was postcards being made by the various shops around town. They'd stock these new postcards showing the progress. And people who lived here would buy them and send them to their friends back in who knows where. And that's where they stayed. Because once they're there, they don't come back until eBay came along, and then people could put them on there, and then I could bid on them and bring them home where they belonged. So a lot of these were obtained locally at postcard shows, but I'd say half of them came from eBay, that came from all over the country. So the story behind Longview, just a real quick introduction to it, is that R.A. Long and Longville, they were close to logging out the southern timber acreage they had. They were deciding whether they should shut the company down or come west where there was lots of timber, and they decided to come out here. That decision was made around 1918 or 1919. They came out and they bargained with Weyerhaeuser Company to buy a bunch of timberland up by Riderwood, which is now Riderwood, and then they decided they'd build the big sawmills here in Longview. The world's largest sawmills were built here in Longview. And so in 1921, they sent out the people to try to talk to the farmers in the valley here to buy the land. They got options to all the farms in the entire Cowlitz Valley here that's now Longview. All but two people they offered their land at a reasonable price. And one of those people they lived over at Peardale Lane in Kelso. That's why the 3rd Avenue used to zigzag around it. And there was one other farmer that had a site down on what's Weyerhaeuser now, and they eventually sold that land later. But most of the people sold their land for about $100 an acre, and which was a lot of money then, 1920, but not near what it was worth if they would have kept it. So in 1921, they got the options. They exercised the options in 21. By August of 22, they had hired planners to come in and help plan the city. Nichols and Kessler, names you hear. Vandercook Way is named after Vandercook, who was the chief engineer. But these people were brought in, and they planned out the city and decided what they were going to do and how to do it. And it was on a very short timeline, because R.A. Long was in 1922, he was 72 years old. and he wanted to build this new sawmill in this city. So they knew they couldn't, take 20 years to do it. And so they rushed it through. So in 1923, they started construction. Actually, they started construction of the Hotel Monticello in late 22, but in 23, they were starting construction of the downtown Longview, putting in the sewer lines and starting to pave streets. And between July or August of 1922 and July of 1923, the progress was so amazing. You'll see that here in a minute in the pictures. And so what I'm going to try to show you here is some of the early pictures that you may or may not have seen, but it just shows how fast things happened in those days. And they basically it was just getting out of the horse-drawn wagon era. So this is an aerial photograph taking about 1925 or 26. And I forgot to bring my pointer, so I will just have to talk about it. Over there on the far right side is the Columbia Theater. And you can see Broadway runs up to the hotel up there. Off out here in the field, there's a building out there, right up in here. That was a garage. It wasn't. I mean, we know it now, or well, we knew it years ago that was a Chrysler garage, but in those days it was a parking garage. Here we go. Thank you. And there was an ordinance in Longview that prohibited parking cars on the city streets at night. So anybody that was staying at the Hotel Monticello, if you're staying at the Hotel Monticello, you stayed there, you parked out front, but at nighttime you couldn't leave your car out there. And so they would pay a guy to come over and drive the cars over to the Monticello garage and park them upstairs. And the next morning they'd bring them back and they'd be out front waiting for the person when they got out of bed. Pretty good operation. This picture, like I say, was in 1925 or 26 because the Columbia Theater was built was opened in 1925. When they first built Longview, the hotel was opened in July of 24, but out here, this area was what they call Skidville. And it was a bunch of tents basically on skids that they could drag around. That's where the people lived that were working in the town at that time. And when they opened the hotel, there were several stories written about it because it was a magnificent hotel in the middle of this flat valley. There was nothing else out there. But the people writing the story, they were not too impressed by this Skidville that was right next to it. And R.A. Long didn't like it either. He said he made them get out of there. So here's the picture that I like, probably my favorite one of my slides. This was taken February 8, 1923. There's Broadway, future Broadway. And you can see there's farmhouses around here and there. This was all stuff that was there when they bought the land. But right down here is the Bon Marché, which became the Merc, or actually it was the Mercantile that became the Bon Marché, now it's the Merc again. But so they had no streets paved at this point, February 8, 1923. The city was dedicated on, in early 1924, the actual dedication took place in July, but the dedication took place in February. So a year later, a lot of what you see here had changed to that. This picture actually was taken about 1925, but so some of these buildings out here weren't there, some of these, but that was, this was here, the street was paved here. The passenger station was opened in 1925, so I know that picture was taken about that time. But you look back at that and you say, there to there, 1 year. So could you do that today with all the modern equipment and everything we have? Probably not. So this is Commerce Avenue. There's the Merck building down here, so we're a block south of the Merck. The trucks they had hard rubber tires, and everything was, this is, Model T time. 1922, 1923, 1924. This was 1924. They had the Pageant of Progress, the 1 year anniversary. In those days, they parked the cars diagonal on both sides of the street and had a lane of traffic going each way. No traffic lights on the corner of Broadway and Commerce, and you just walked across wherever you felt like it. Corton's building, which was later built right down here, in those days, Corton's was located way down over here somewhere. This was a year later. They had got rid of the diagonal parking and made parallel parking. They had room for 4 lanes of traffic, just like it was back when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s. It was 2 lanes of traffic each way and parallel parking. But yeah, that's a monster flag up there. I'm not even sure what it has on it. It's not a rectangular flag. It's got a pointed pennant on it, so it's probably the Long Bill symbol or something. Because this was the Long Bill building. They had their offices in there, and that was the Columbia River Mercantile, the company store. If you worked at Long Bill, you could come in there and buy stuff against your paycheck that was to come, and that way nobody could quit because they had to keep working to pay off their bill. 1925. The Columbia Theater was built out there by itself on the corner down there. This was a bus. They had 6 of these buses that they ran between Kelso, down through Longview, all the way down to the where the bridge across to Rainier is now. There was a ferry down there, which we'll see a little bit later. But so people that lived in Rainier, because they didn't have the houses yet, so people lived in Rainier and Kelso and had to get to work and all that. So they had 6 of these buses ran every 20 minutes from Kelso, and made a loop going. In the same year, 1925, they built the Peking Theater. This was a theater built, somebody contracted with a local contractor. His name was Val Coidback. You probably remember Coidback Construction from back in the 50s and 60s. Well, Coidback built this theater for somebody, but the guy defaulted. He didn't pay the money, and so Coidback got stuck with it. So he and his family lived upstairs, and they ran the theater as a theater. And so they changed the name about 1930 or early 30s from the Peking to the Roxy. And the Roxy was the primary theater in Longview that had movies. This one here was a stage theater that had stage shows more so. So this is down there. This is across. This is down on Florida. Florida runs across here, and Freddie's Fish for the Halibut thing is right across the street here. Down here? Yeah. And that's where Corton's was right there in those days. But you can see here there's a cleaners, there's a tire store, there's all kinds of interesting stores in these old photographs. You see them. This theater became the Roxy. It was the primary theater up through about World War II, and then Sterling Theaters bought it. They also operated the Longview Theater. They turned the Longview into the main theater, and this showed B-rate movies, and then they finally shut down in the late 40s, and it's struggled ever since. It's now being refurbished by a church. They're going to turn it into a theater again. It'll be a church from on Sundays, but they'll have some theater type stuff there. This is the Longview National Bank. I don't think anybody here probably recalls that particular name, but when we were kids, that was the National Bank of Commerce. That's where the Longview Police Station is now. You can see the Longview National Bank up there. This bank opened on May 22nd, 1924, and this is what the lobby looked like. And I remember that, going in there, that bank, you had to go in here to one of the cashiers on this side, line up to do your transactions. I'd put my 15 cents for my school deposit in my savings account. Pretty impressive building, and I still cringe when I look at that building and think, we tore that down. Of all the buildings that we should have saved, that was one of the really nice ones.
When did they tear it down?
Oh, I really don't remember. Probably 70s, mid-70s, I suspect. This is the early 1940s Longview. Busy city. Every store was full of, had a business in it. They were good businesses. They weren't secondhand stores. These were viable businesses. You look around, you see like there's Len's Flowers. Later it moved, of course, to another location. But a lot of these early street scenes, it's fun to look at the store names because you see a store that moved from one place to another, and as they grew, they prospered, they moved up to the better part of town. That was the AFL-CIO. That's where they had their meeting hall for the unions. Labor Temple, yeah. And there's a lot of these places, like there's a sports center, that was a tavern. I mean, there's a lot. When Longview was first built, there was an ordinance against any signs hanging out over the sidewalk like this. These were not allowed. They were allowed to have a sign that stuck out 12 inches. That was it. Well, the businesses didn't like that at all. So they got that changed pretty quick. And then later years, this is the 1950s. We all remember Newberry's. If you lived here, that was a great place. And the Longview Theater down there. Red Skelton movie was being shown. And here's then the other landmark store was the old Woolworth store. And if you remember that one, you went in there and they had you could go inside. They had a little place you could have a lunch counter, and it was a wonderful little store. That was my favorite place to go when I was a kid. This is 1926. The church was built. R.A. Long hoped to have he didn't want to have a whole bunch of different churches, so he had this one church that was, it was for the whole community. That's why it's called the community church. And it was not any particular religious action that was supposed to bring people together. And so this is an interesting picture because it shows 1926, the lake. You can see how the banks, there's nothing grown there yet. They dredged out there used to be a slough there called Fowler's Slough, and they brought in the dredge and they dredged out a couple of million yards of sand out of here to fill in on the old west side and the area behind Kessler School, because it was so low they had to raise it up. So all the Columbia River, R.A. Long actually had 6 dredges running. He bought 4 and he built 2, and they dredged all this out. And that's what made Longview, by having the sloughs and the drainage system they had, it wasn't so solid. By the way, if anybody has any questions at all, we can stop and talk about it. So if you go up on top of the bell tower here and look back down Kessler, this is the view that was there in 1926. There was no houses whatsoever in the area between all the way up to 20th, washed away to 20th to Kessler Boulevard. There was nothing in there. It was just bare land like that. And they were getting ready here. They're building a bridge pontoon here to build a bridge across. Every island had a bridge to it. Out here you can see all the houses. Those were all built in 1924 and 25 and maybe up to 26. That was where the people that worked in the mill were encouraged to live. It was only a mile away from the mill, and they could walk if they had to, but they also had the buses and ran. And they made good money, $50 an hour. This is Kessler, and that's Nichols over there. So 20th Avenue would be down about here, and washed away would be behind you. Well, there's 1928. R.A. Long High School was built and opened in 1928. Each island had a wooden bridge to it like this, and the parks were all planted and manicured. That was about the last year it looked this nice, because Longview started having problems financially. The Great Depression hadn't hit yet, but lumber was not selling as good as it had in the early 20s, and so they were not, it was the last year they paid a dividend, was 1927, and then they started going in the hole after that. But all the money they borrowed in 1921, 22, 23, 24, and so on to build Longview, they paid all that back by 1928. So they didn't go under right away, but they had to default on a lot of the land. The parkland, like Lake Sacagawea, it was up for a tax auction at one time. And luckily it didn't get bought by some real estate developer, because he would have had houses all along the lake bank. Another bridge, each bridge was different. And it's a shame that they didn't keep them up, because they were nice. Kessler School was built in 1924. First they only built half of it, and then a year later they built the other half. And that was the grade school, junior high, high school. R.A. Long built this and gave this to the, I'll back up here. Kessler was built by R.A. Long, but the Longview School District bought the building when he was done. It was part of, it wasn't a written agreement, but they agreed that they wanted to have a school, and so he built it for them, and then they bought it from him. R.A. Long High School, though, he built that and gave it to the city as a gift. And that was opened in 1928. I went to school there, and it's an interesting how, you assume things that aren't factual, but when I went there, I thought this part back here was an addition later. It was part of the original school, but look at these trees out here. That's the trees that are there now. And then here's the other end of it. I always thought that was a later addition, but that was built from the very beginning. And that was the engineering wing out there, wood shop was out there and stuff like that. But it's just, you look at that, the trees, not much has changed except the trees have got bigger. This is not a photograph, this is a printed postcard that was made from a photograph, I suppose, but it's an aerial view that shows the Oregon Way ends. They built these as dormitories right from the beginning. That was one of the first things they built, was these hotels, basically, for the people that came into work in building Longview. When they were building the Hotel Monticello, they built the hotel, and they started 300 homes down here at the same time. So they had all these people either working here, living here, or living over in Skidville. And once they got the houses built, then they tore down Skidville, and the people that worked in the mill could afford to buy these homes. And the water tower was there, and that's on between 19th and 18th. There's 20th Avenue up here. This is 30th Avenue right there. So that's Baltimore, yeah. But this is the water tower, so they, there's no sign of that now. Somebody's got a house sitting on that lot probably. Doesn't even know they've got a 24-inch water line underneath them. As you can see here, Lake Sacagawea runs along here, and it turns the corner and heads down there, and there's Ocean Beach Highway way up on that end up there. So this is where Washington Way is right there. And that, so you can see nothing out here in that part of town, nothing in the St. Helens Addition, the Olympic Addition, all this area out Ocean Beach, none of that was being developed yet. When Longview was designed, Nichols, he wanted the planned city to be a planned city, and thus he wanted to have districts, or additions as they call them, where the city, rather than growing like a typical city from a small core and growing out, Longview was designed to grow as a central downtown area, a hub, and then having these various neighborhoods that would, as the population increased, you would develop these different additions. And so that's why he built all the houses down here to begin with. They built over behind the hotel. They built the nicer houses for the people that had a little more money. But it wasn't until the 40s and 50s that they developed the areas out here that around our Longview. There's just nothing out there.
That second hotel building, is that still the Oregon Way Hotel that stands now? Or?
This one right here would be the one that's be that one there, I think. No, it'd be this one here. They had the car lot in the corner, so I think there's that one. The hotel is there now. These were all torn down. An interesting story behind that, nothing to do with this picture, but I remember when they tore these down, they were selling things off that people could come in and buy, the used doors or the whatever they wanted. And this one old guy come in there, and he wanted to buy the downspouts and the gutters. And they were beat up and ugly and painted and just been there for 80, 70 years. And they said, yeah, you can have them. How much you give it? Whatever. They were copper. He knew that because he'd built the place. So he got a lot of copper for next to nothing.
Pretty good.
Another nice aerial photograph. This was taken probably about 1925 or 6. Again, you can see the Columbia Theater over here. Broadway running up the middle here, and the hotel is right there in the corner. This is the train station that opened in 1925. And back down here is the train tracks that ran in that came across the Cowlitz down up here by the Longview Y, and it ran all the way up along the west bank of the Cowlitz up to Riderwood. That's how they brought their logs into the mill. And they managed to convince the train companies to run a couple of passenger trains every day into here. Kelso didn't like that at all, because it was, they wanted the people coming to Kelso. But it only lasted for 8 years. The bridge across the Cowlitz washed out in the 1933 flood. By then, the Great Depression was on. They didn't have the money to rebuild that right away, and they sold off the railroad tracks along the Cowlitz to the Milwaukee line, I think it was, to raise money to help pay off some of the bonds. So the train station only lasted for 8 years, and then it became a hospital, the Cowlitz General Hospital. And later they built a modern hospital over here and tore down this. There's a carnival going on right here. And if you look down here in the corner, you can see here's the Longview, Portland, and Northern Railroad Freight Station. Vandercook Way was right along here, so you can see the theater was built. Some of the buildings right there on that block were built. But Commerce Avenue right here, there was 2 blocks of Commerce that were pretty well built up, and only a building here and there. And the Broadway Hotel, Community House, that there now. But if it hadn't been for the Great Depression, I think Longview would have kept growing because it really had a good start, but times they weren't on the side. There's the train station that was down there at the foot of Broadway. And the distance from the hotel to the train station was a mile. So when people came to town on the train in those days, and you had your reservation at the Hotel Monticello, you looked up the road and said, "I've got to carry my bags a mile?" And of course, they had the buses or the taxi cabs to do it. But that was the big complaint in the early years, as Longview was laid out over this huge area, a lot of empty space in between. And people couldn't understand why you'd build a city that way, but it was a planned city. It's the largest planned city built in America after Washington D.C. Everything else started small and grew out, and they had to tear down and rebuild. Longview, basically, what they built stayed. This is the back side of the train station, so you would come out of the door here and go up a ramp, and this was the platform where the train ran along right out here. The Longview Y, which is out, the present way in the Longview now that comes across the Cowlitz River, and R.A. Long didn't like the fact that in 1923, the only way to Longview was to come across the ferry from Rainier or to come across the bridge through Kelso. The Ocean Beach Highway didn't exist, and there was no other way in. And so he wanted a bridge across the Cowlitz River down at the south end there, and he tried to get the state to do it, but they didn't have any interest in it. And he didn't really have the money for it. This is 1927, and so one of the last things they built was the old Pioneer Bridge, which is up here. This is a ramp going up to it, and the bridge is right out there. It goes across, so that brought people into Longview without having to go through Kelso. They put a sign out here by the highway, and it says, "Shortcut to Seattle." And Kelso didn't appreciate that at all, because everybody in those days, the towns all relied on cars coming through town and stopping to get some gas or do whatever they needed, tires, food, repairs. So his sign here, you can't read it real clear, but Longview was 2.5 miles. Seattle's 159 miles. Today, you go from Longview to Seattle, it's 120 miles. So they've taken 40 miles off the route because they don't detour through all these little towns around, Toledo, Vader, you name it. The land filter on the would be somewhere up in that area there. The original landfill was on the right side of the bridge over here, Gerhardt Gardens, and it was an open burning landfill. You drive into Longview, you got the full dose before you even got to Longview. When you got to Kalama, you could smell Longview. And you get up here, you drive up across this bridge, and it was a little narrow bridge. The ramps were made out of wood planks, and they were loose and they rattled. And I remember I was a kid, 5 years old, and I'd get down the back seat floorboards because it scared me to death. This car going across there, and clack, 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 and it was so narrow. And they tried their best to get the state to take it over, and they finally did eventually because Longview couldn't maintain it anymore. But that was the way. And you got up there on the bridge, you looked out, you saw the Longview Fiber off to your left with its smoke and the stench coming out. You saw Long Bill's 2 smokestacks with its smoke. You looked down the distance, you saw Weyerhaeuser with its smokestacks. Pacific Straw Board was on the right with its smokestacks, and there was a landfill burning raw garbage. And you got to drive through all this, and you get down to about a mile down, you had to go underneath the train tracks.
Right.
And so there was a tunnel. And we'll see that in a second. Here's the Pioneer Bridge. It was very, very cheaply built. This section here washed out in 1933, and they finally rebuilt it, but it was, just one bill couldn't do it, the state had to do it. But anyway, further on, so Longview's on down this way. So you come to this tunnel, except when it was high water, and it was a lake.
Yeah.
There was a concrete barrier or partition between the two lanes here because there was heavy trains going across, and so they put that there, and there more than one car hit that, and more than one person died. And teenagers, being teenagers, and probably with the help of a couple bottles of beer, would race each other from the Pioneer Bridge into town. And the first person in the tunnel was supposed to pull over to the right side and go on through. And the couple guys would just race through the wrong side of the tunnel. Once in a while, there'd be a head-on collision because you couldn't see the cars coming at you. So you can still find this tunnel down there. On the west side of this, you can see the top part of this where it says 1926 Longview. You can see that on the other side of the train tracks. They filled the tunnel in, but that part's still there. This is an aerial view of the west side. This is California Way, what used to be California Way. Right here, this wall, that's where the road goes down under the tunnel, which is right up here. This was Exeter Lumber Company, and there's all kinds of little gypsum mills that have been along here over the years. There's still a little sawmill there. That's the Long Bill log pond out there, which we'll see later. This was the ferry across from Rainier to Longview. In 1922, there was a 5-car ferry. And so Long Bill paid for and put in this 25-car ferry. There was 2 ferries, the Oregon and the Washington. And they were full, with people working in Longview going back and forth. There was several thousand people a day would use the ferry. So I don't know what the fares were. It only operated for about 6 or 7 years until the Rainier Bridge was built. This shows the ferry here coming in. They had apparently had another barge that they would drive off onto the barge and up the ramp and all. So this is the only picture you're going to see today that's not a, quote, genuine original postcard. This is a postcard. You can buy it out here in the gift shop, but it's a reproduction of a photograph. It's one of my favorite pictures of Longview because it's clearly. If you've ever been to the masthead, you see the big picture over there. February 12th, 1930. It took them less than a year to build this bridge. The Washington Way Bridge they just got done building, that took them more than a year. So you think about that. So this is the Longview side here. This is the Rainier side. So people think that was the bridge that they designed originally, but originally Oregon was going to build a bridge there. Before Longview was even a thought, in 1918 they started talking about a bridge. In 1921, the Oregon legislature approved a commission to design and look at building a bridge, and the bridge they came up with was this. It's not as tall. This bridge here has 194 feet from the water to the bottom of the bridge. This one was 155 feet. And rather than being a quarter mile between the center piers, this is only 750 feet. But this was the bridge that Oregon designed. But yet, a year later, or 2 years later, when Longview started coming along, Oregon started getting nervous because they thought by building a bridge, people from Washington would come over to Oregon to shop. Because you couldn't drive to Portland in those days on the highway. You had to go across to the Oregon side and down the highway. But once Longview came along, they said, we're going to lose all of our people in Rainier and St. Helens and Glasscounty are going to come to Longview to shop. So they started trying to stop this bridge. The very bridge they wanted to build, they wouldn't allow. They said it's got to be taller. They wanted it to be 194 feet, so 40 feet higher. And the center post had to be another 500 feet wider. That raised the cost from $2 million to about almost $6 million. This is $1929. But it was financed privately by Wesley Vandercook, who was the chief engineer of Long Bill. And he got a guy from Seattle named Combs, and they put together the money, and Bethlehem Steel and agreed to help finance it, and they built the bridge in less than a year. So there's the bridge we have, and it's a much more attractive bridge in my opinion. This is from Rainier looking across to Longview. So this is sometime after about 1930, I would get. Well, it has to be after 1930 because the bridge opened in March of 1930. But there's the Weyerhaeuser plant site here, and the smoke's coming out of the burners and all. They had these pilings on the ramp going up on the western side. Now that's all rock up to quite a ways up before you get to where it's a bridge thing here. And the Oregon side, they hadn't removed the piling out in the river yet. And the cranes are still up on the very top here. This is probably, right when they opened the bridge. This was the Oregon side, and it was a wooden ramp all the way down around the corner, and it joined on to what was called Washington Way, and it ran up into Rainier. And then later, with the rock pit that was over there, when they filled in all this area from here on with rock, and they turned the corner and came in down here. This is the part I find amazing. Of course, 1929 and 1930, when they were building this, everybody had money, and they thought they could make this work. But to drive across the bridge one way was 80 cents for the car and driver, plus another 15 cents for each passenger. So that's 1930. Well, even if you say, okay, it's 10 times as much now, that's still $10, $15 to drive across one way, or if you want to do a round trip, you can do it for a little bit more, but they didn't get a lot of business. And they didn't even make enough money to pay the bonds off. So in 1934, I think it was Bethlehem Steel took over the debt, and in 1947 they sold the bridge to the state of Washington. And the state bought it at the perfect time because after the war, people started having money and they started going across. And the tolls dropped from $1 down to 75 cents to 60 cents, and finally it was 50 cents until they were finally removed in 1965. So this just kind of tells you here the bridge was, from one end of the bridge to the other is a mile and 6/10, but the bridge itself is just a little over a mile of actual bridge. The roadway is 210 feet up there, but the bottom of the bridge is 195. Top is 340 feet above the water. And compared to the Pioneer Bridge, this bridge was built to haul heavy loads. And the Pioneer Bridge, it could barely haul cars across it. So they built this bridge to last, and it's a great bridge. This is up on the bridge looking north at the Weyerhaeuser plant site. This is probably about 1930. Weyerhaeuser bought 2 miles of waterfront from Long Bill. Long Bill offered them their choice of any one of 3 choice industrial sites. Weyerhaeuser took a couple of years to decide. They wanted all 3. And Long Bill didn't really want to sell all 3, but they needed somebody else to come in and help generate more jobs. So this was the track where they brought the train, the load cars in here, and the track right through here was at an angle. So the cars were already tilted, and then the current would carry them down here, and this is what they called the gap. And they would sort the logs out. You might put fir in here and hemlock there, cedar here, and whatever. Each of these places had a certain species and quality of logs, and they would go into the sawmills down here and cut them up. That's Mount Coffin down there. R.A. Long did not ever own Mount Coffin. People call it Coffin Rock, but it's not. It's Mount Coffin. Coffin Rock was over in the Oregon side. This was the Indian burial ground that was written about by Lewis and Clark and the early explorers, where there was hundreds of Indians buried up there. They'd put them in canoes up on stilts, and they'd be up on the mountainside there. Star Sand and Gravel bought that rock from one of the homesteaders in 1908, and they started mining gravel on this side over here and working their way back. So when R.A. Long came around in 1921, that was not for sale. So they built the dike, they put in this as a dike all the way along here, they went around the thing. And so when Weyerhaeuser bought the land, they didn't get that land either. But later they wanted to put in a chlorine plant up there, and so they tried to buy it from Star Sand and Gravel, and Star Sand said, no, this is our moneymaker. A lot of gravel here we're going to sell. So Weyerhaeuser worked a deal. They said, well, we'll buy your gravel. Go ahead and quarry it and just dump it out here in the low areas around the plant site here. And when you get done, we'll buy your land. So they did in 1954, I think it was, and bought it and built the chemical plant. This is the sawmill, Weyerhaeuser sawmill. Looking up there, there's Coffin Rock again, or Mount Coffin. They call it Coffin Rock too. This is the sawmill. That's Weyerhaeuser's sulfite mill that they built in 1931. This was built in 1920. It started in 1929. And you can see, if you look on some of the real, on the good pictures, this is a print. Again, this is an offset print. But there's cranes out here, and they'd mine the rock and load it on ships. A lot of the bar at the mouth of the Columbia came from here. They big rocks from there. They were, the first time that they got destroyed was explorers in 1841 came up and they camped at the base of it, and somebody decided to do some urban renewal, so the story goes, and they lit a fire and burned all the brush and all the Indian caskets on there. And so there probably wasn't very many more added after that, because in 1841, by 1847, the homesteaders were coming out. Indians were being forced out of the area. And so there was a lady, I forget her first name now, last name, Olson, Mrs. Olson, lived out there, and she wrote stories when she was a little girl. They'd go out there around it, and they'd find Indian beans or whatever, yeah.
Biggest producing mill, I mean, at the time, Weyerhaeuser or Longview?
Well, Longview, when it was built, and it went into operation in 1924, it was the largest in the world. But when Weyerhaeuser came along and Longview built 2 sawmills. Weyerhaeuser built 3 there, Mill A, Mill B, and then there was another mill. The Mill A, Mill B they cut huge logs, bigger than Longview could cut. So Weyerhaeuser was the largest. Well, they always claimed to be the largest integrated wood products company in the world, but they put out more lumber at that time than Longview did. But Longview for a while actually outproduced Weyerhaeuser when they had the choicest logs coming in from the Riderwood. But just you look at this and we'll look at Longview in a minute here. But these sawmills were built in a year. I was down there. I worked at Weyerhaeuser. I was there when they modernized the pulp mill. It took them years to replace things or put in new whatever. I mean, things were done fast in those days, and they didn't have these giant cranes and everything else that we have now. So it was truly an amazing time to have been around. At the Mount Coffin, there was homesteaders around there, and there was one guy. His name was Crumline Ledoux. And he had a little store there in a dock that went out in the Columbia, and he had a post office in his store, and it was the Mount Coffin post office. I've never seen a postmark with Mount Coffin, but he ran it from 1872 until he died in 1894. And his son took it over and ran it, and to honor his father, he had the name changed to Ledoux. And it stayed Ledoux until he sold the post office to a man, the store and all the land, in 1908, I think it was, and then the store and the post office shut down around 1913. So this is up on top of Mount Coffin, looking out at the Weyerhaeuser Mill. That's Washington Way, heading up towards Longview. The community church is up there. Right here is 32nd Avenue. 30th would be right up about there. So here's the wood sheds are still out there along Industrial Way. This hemlock silo is still there, but everything else is gone. This is the old sulfite mill. In those days, they had one pulp machine that all they did was made pulp, and it was just square bales of pulp they'd export it and make it into paper somewhere else. This fence right down here is around the Mount Coffin quarry. Weyerhaeuser didn't own anything inside this fence. This picture is the same place, only looking a little more south. So you can see here, here's this building with the curved roof. And it's the same building here. So this building is still there. The cargo export dock is still here. These are the sawmill powerhouse, the old east powerhouse they call it. This was mill A and mill B were here. So logs out in the river were brought down here and came up a chain incline, pulled in the mill, cut, then run out to the green chains and out to the dry kilns and stored in the big sheds out here. So these two pictures were taken on top of Mount Coffin, and you can superimpose them to make one panorama. And you can see there's no houses out here in this area yet. This is 1931 or 32 probably. These pictures were taken by a guy named Rankin, Harold Rankin, or Howard Rankin. He had a shop in Longview on 14th Avenue, a little photography shop. And he had lots of neat pictures of Longview. And my understanding is when he retired and sold the business, the person that bought it threw all the negatives away. I don't think he got any of them here. Yeah, but not his archives. So that picture was taken from one side of Mount Coffin. Then there's two more later that were taken from on the west corner of the Coffin Rock that showed the original thing, but a little bit better detail, different day because there's smoke coming out of the smokestacks now. But so again, you can see the export dock and you can see the bridge down here. And you see the logs being sorted in the river. And again, those two pictures will superimpose into a panorama. Those are a couple of my favorite ones because I spent 37 years there.
Isn't that the Longview dike?
This is the dike. Yeah. When Longview built Longview, before there was anything built, they brought in these 6 dredges, and they dredged several million yards of sand out of the Columbia and the Cowlitz to build these dikes. And you can see the dike goes from here up to the middle here and then down to there. It's just a huge broad, and it's just sand. They put in a trestle down the middle, a wooden trestle, that they could put a pipe on, and they'd pump the sand in there, and they'd take a section off every so often and keep moving backwards. So inside that dike is a wooden skeleton, basically. The dike goes all the way around Longview. Originally, they were just going to dike the area where Longbill is down there and say, we're going to protect our mill, but the people living out there they'll have to live with the floods. But Vandercook said, no, you can't do that. So they were going to do a little bit more of Longview up to about here. Vandercook kept saying, no, you need to do the whole valley. And R.A. Long didn't want to do that because this is a lot of money. And so Vandercook said, well, if you don't want to do it, how about let me pay for that additional dike? I'll be glad to do it. And, make that be a part of the town. R.A. Long ended up putting the dike all the way around out to, all the way out to Coal Creek. And, there was 14,000 acres of land. A lot more than they needed. But it was cheaper to do that than to go out to Mount Coffin and then go across Mount Solo and across to the Columbia Heights area. That's what they planned on doing. This is about 1947. This was the plywood plant here. That was built in 47, so this could be 47, 48, 49. Again, you get a feel here for the logs. They come down here to these little spillways and they get pulled into there's one sawmill, 2 sawmills, 3rd sawmill. They cut the fir in one, the hemlock in another, and the spruce in another. This was the pulp mill up here. By then it had grown, there was 2 pulp machines, and then about that time they put in a 3rd machine that made what they call milk carton stock, of a heavier board and a corrugated medium and all that. There's Reynolds down there. It was built in 1941. The mint field out here. And this area, this is the slough here, so 33rd Avenue is right about here. So there's houses down about here now. I don't see the Weyerhaeuser Railroad there, so maybe that might be it right there. Yeah, that's the Weyerhaeuser Railroad that comes in. So there's no houses on this side over here. But there's Mint Valley and all the stuff out there that's all built up now. And there's a cut through Mount Solo right here where they put a road through rather than having to run it around the outside. This was a log that used to be at the main entrance to Weyerhaeuser. I don't know how tall these young ladies are, but I'm guessing they're 5 foot or more. Well, that's a 10 foot or 11 foot diameter log. Big one. And they could cut that size of log that that sawmill and Weyerhaeuser had. Another aerial view of the Weyerhaeuser sulfite mill, again about 1933 or 34. That was their main office at that time. They added on to it later. The managers had a parking garage out here that had a covered parking garage because in those days, these mills were, they were polluters. I mean, at nighttime, they'd blow their stacks and there'd be all this white salt cake come out. You could park your car outside at night and you'd wake up in the morning, you'd have a white car. And so the bosses got to park in a covered garage and the mill workers parked out here. And you didn't have a good car, you drove down the mill because they rusted out. The tops of the fenders, and the hood were all, you could see right down to the tires because of all this acid and corrosion that was in the air. And people breathed this stuff. And I mean, they used to joke about it, not really a joke, but it was, kind of a sad joke. People that worked in the bleach plant out here where you had all this acid and caustic fumes, the bleaching elements, the chlorine. If you were lucky enough to live to where you could retire, the average age was a year. And now people drive Cadillacs to work for parking because their air is, all the environmental stuff for water and air is made it a great place. Well, yeah, the cars can get, but even that won't. That's not as bad as that's crushed rock, and so it's not going to eat you up like the caustic stuff did in the old days. Yeah. This is looking across to the Long Bill site from Rainier. Long Bill had two mills. They had one right here, and there was one down here. Eventually, they built this one first. And so they had these huge storage sheds, which many of you might have seen. They tore them down about 1990. Bill Gates used a bunch of the beams in them for his house. But the Cowlitz River is up here. In 1927, Long Bill sold this land to Longview Fiber to build a pulp mill. They were very reluctant to do it because they didn't want to have a town that smelled too bad. So the people invited them to come up to a pulp mill up in Wisconsin and smell a mill, and Larry Long sent up his official smelling team, and they came back and reported, well, that's not too bad. And then later, Vandercook managed to get one of the managers at the mill to send him a bottle of air, just a glass jar of air. He smelled it, and then he says, this is terrible. And it was, and it was. Anybody that grew up in Longview knows that Longview had many a day where of course our noses got used to it, but you could smell the mills at Kalama. But anyway, so that's the site there. These next pictures just show the Long Bill site. This is when they only had the one sawmill here. They built a second one over here later, but they wanted to get this up and going so they could have, first of all, profits coming in, but they needed some lumber to build all this stuff too. So they had built the sawmill. They had the powerhouse here. This was their wood waste incinerator, but they used it to make electricity. They made way more electricity than Longview could use. And that's why Longview Fiber came along, because they said, we're just burning this wood waste, and Longview Fiber would use it for a raw material. So they did that. These sheds where they stored the lumber here, and a lot of lumber out there. This is the Industrial Way, runs along here. That's the slough along Industrial Way. Weyerhaeuser eventually bought this and built up there, but this would be 1924. So they started building that sawmill in 1923, August of 23, and they were running it in July of 24. This is the second sawmill here. There's one just like it over here. You can't see the end of it, but they're identical mills. This shows again just the first mill here. The second one hasn't been built yet, but you can see here there's a log pond out here, a small log pond behind, and here's a channel that runs out over here. It's just a small little water channel, and a big log pond out back here. So the logs were brought down by train and dumped in the log pond, or were brought in on the river, and the Cowlitz had a connection to it, and they would bring the logs down into the mill here and saw them up. You can see the streets in Longview. You can see they're being laid out. And I'm not sure what I'm not sure what the different buildings are. I'd have to think it through to figure out where that could be. It's probably the Monticello Hotel that could be Very Long High School, I guess. This is taken from the bridge. Looking back at it, you see Mount St. Helens here back when it was a ice cream cone. Those sheds were massive. I mean, the beams in there were like 24-inch by 24-inch beams. I mean, they were just gigantic beams. So here you get a better view of this big log pond out here. And then they brought them in this thing and down here into the sawmill or here. They come out of the sawmill and the sorting lines and then go back here into the dry kilns and then put them in the sheds to ship out. They had a long dock here, the export dock. Longview fiber built down here eventually. This picture was taken about 1925 or 26. Port of Kilsall. Ever heard of that one? This is where the Port of Longview is now. The Longview Rainier Bridge runs across back here. You can't see it because it's not built yet. In 1921 or 22, when Kilsall managed to vote away the county seat from Kalama, one of the first things they did was decide that, this is before Longview came into existence, but they decided they wanted to have a port district. Because by then shipping was becoming a little bigger thing, and the stern whalers used to come to Kilsall, they needed a dock to bring the bigger things in, so they were going to build a port dock somewhere, and they thought about Carroll's down that area would be a good spot, because it's on the Columbia. And then about that time, R.A. Long came along, and so Kilsall, they were not very happy about this new city going to take over their thing, and so they decided they wanted to build a dock down here at the foot of what's now Oregon Way. And they already had passed the ordinance or whatever to get the port district, so when they built this dock, with R.A. Long's blessing, the building that they built down here, there's a shed, this is shed number 1, but on the end of the building it says Port of Kilsall. And it wasn't supposed to be that way, but somebody got up there and painted it on there, and R.A. Long said, just don't mess around with it now, let's get this thing dedicated and we'll change it. And they did. So you can see here, I'll back up again here. This is a real narrow section of the dock here, but this train track goes up here and it curves and goes up around here. And you can see that coming down here. The train track comes down here and curves and comes in right through there where that white line is. And this is just a single narrow dock here where they could dock 3 ships here, 3 big ocean-going ships here. So originally they just had shed 1 down here, and they put in this bigger shed. Later they built this grain silo, which is still there, and they're going to tear that down. But the port dock owned this triangle piece of land. And Long Bill owned everything else from here down, all the way down, and eventually fiber. There's fiber down there. You can see it now in this picture. So this is about 1931 or 2 maybe. Here's the Weyerhaeuser log dump here coming in. Another picture from the bridge, but you can just see this is just a wonderful city to come into. If you're a tourist, you came in right through you come in across the Pioneer Bridge, across got the full Monty on this. This is that grain silo. This is in 1927 when they built it. And look how, it looks just like that now. I always thought it was run down. But it was run down when they built it. Reynolds, of course, they built that in 1941, made high quality aluminum for the Warriors, the airplanes, and so on. It was a rush project, and again, one of these things that Longview was good at. I mean, they started that, we're done in a year. So we're about to the end here. These are a couple of the pictures I have. I mean, like I say, I only collect postcards, so there's a lot of pictures of trains and everything else, but I don't have many of the old trains. But this is Weyerhaeuser's steamboat. It used to be parked out behind the main office. And then there was the Longview, Portland, and Northern, which was the Long Bill Railroad. That's the one that ran from the Longview Y up to Riderwood. They didn't have a Long Bill Railroad. They had a Longview, Portland, and Northern. And so that was, it was built in April of 1926, that particular engine. And the last one was the Longview Fiber engine. Anybody recognize that man standing up there? It's not me. I think Jim might recognize him. It's his dad. That's Jim Elliott's dad. So, that's all the pictures I have here. That's 60 pictures out of my 600. So, anybody have any questions?